Okay, I'm signed out right now. I'm going to sign in. My things did not show up, but they're there. Let's check my React DevTools. Look at app, state, there's the UID. So what's the problem? We alluded to this problem earlier, but it took this long for us to actually run into it again. We're calling sync state a little early. We need to wait until after we've signed in to do that. So instead of doing it inside component will mount, let's move this to another function that we can call manually from somewhere else. So this base.syncState business, I'm going to take it out of component will mount. I'm going to make a new method. I'm going to put it right under auth handler. I've been calling this setup things. That's kind of a terrible method name. How about setup syncing? Sync things? Sync things is good. Sync things. Yeah. Now I want to call that after I log in. What runs after we log in? After we sign in, we call something. What do we call? It's on the screen. If you don't remember, go look at your sign-in component. What do we call after we sign in? Somebody knows. Auth handler. That's right. And then that's going to update UID and state. Then we can have it call sync things. Now remember, Seth told us the other day that set state could be asynchronous. And if we want to do something after it finishes, in this case, it doesn't return a promise, so we can't use .then. It does it an older way. It uses a callback. So we just pass in what we want to run afterward as the second argument. So we'll say set state, what we want to set state to, and then a second argument, what to run next. And we'll run this dot sync things. Don't put the parens there. We're not running it now. That would pass the return value as the argument here. We want to pass the method itself as the argument. Make sense? So after we sign in, we'll call auth handler. It's going to set state, and after it sets state, it's going to call sync things. Let's sign in. Signing in. I have notes again. All right. So the timing works. What if I refresh the page? No good. Now I think we discovered back before we changed the logic of our signed in method. We saw that we actually are still signed in until we sign out. Firebase does keep track of that across page refreshes. The problem is we're only checking the state of UID, and we're not setting that again when the page loads. We're only setting that right after we log in, right? Right after we actually call the auth handler, and we only call the auth handler after we click the button. So we need to also do that right after the page loads if we're already signed in. So no, you should not have any idea off the top of your head how to manage that. But there is something that we can find out from the Firebase documentation tells us how to do this. And yes, this whole thing is very complicated. Unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as it used to be. But you know, we can understand the individual pieces. And you know what? Right now, if you want to make another app that authenticates with Firebase, just copy it from here. But let's make this work. So there is an event that Firebase emits called auth state change. So this auth object that we created by calling firebase.auth and exporting it has a method called auth.onAuthStateChanged. And we're going to call that in component will mount. You'll notice I didn't get rid of component will mount when I took this set state out of it. So as soon as the component is finished loading, basically, we're going to call auth.onAuthStateChanged. And then we're going to pass an argument in there. It's going to be a function that will run whenever the authentication state changes. So when we refresh the page and Firebase figures out that we are in fact signed in, it's going to run this. So we can use this to manually call auth handler so that set state gets called and sync things gets called. So let's put a little callback function in here. And it's unfortunate that we have several different ways of doing asynchronous things in the same app, but such is our lot in life. I don't think it returns a promise, right? No, it doesn't. Okay. So let's see what this function gives us. I'm just going to put whatever, data here, and let's just say console log data. And let's test our theory that if we're signed in, it should call this thing when we load the page. Save. Okay, it console logged something. So it did what we wanted it to. Now, just what the heck is this? Display name, email, UID. This looks familiar. It looks like it matches authData.user. It doesn't match that authData object. It matches what was at the user key of that authData object. So I'm going to call this user. So what can I do with that? The whole reason we're doing this again is because when we refresh the page, if we're already signed in, our UID doesn't get set in state. And if our UID doesn't get set in state, it doesn't show us the right stuff. Now we already have a method that sets UID in state. Auth handler, right? This is a test of whether anyone's paying attention. I do this a lot, but this time I'm going to make it even more explicit. I just told you the answer to the next question I'm going to ask. I do that a lot. I say a thing, it's going to be the answer to the next question I ask, but since no one was listening, no one knows the answer. It's okay. It's not okay. So what should I do inside here? On auth state change is going to run when I refresh the page and it discovers, oh, I'm already signed in. So I need to call something. The kind of thing I would call right after I sign in. What is it? What do I call right after I sign in? Yes, Mr. Lewis. Auth cussin handler. Auth handler expects an argument. What should this argument look like? Well, it's going to look for authdata.user.uid, so it better have a user key in it, whatever it is, right? So what could we pass into auth handler that matches that? User, we said, is not quite the same as auth data, right? It's equal to authdata.user. So we need to build a new object that has that user at that location. So essentially this. Understand why? This user object here is the thing that has the UID. But auth handler expects that to be authdata.user.uid. So we need to pass in an object that looks like this. Now we've learned on numerous occasions that if we have an object where the name of the key just happens to be the same as the name of the variable that holds its value, we don't have to say user:user, we can just say user. That's a shorthand that came with the S6. And yes, it happens to look just like destructuring, but. Okay, it's screaming. Why is it screaming? Auth handler is not defined because it's this.auth handler. Thank you. This.auth handler. Now it figured out we're signed in. Let's sign out. Put our console back up. I'll leave it up most of the time because if I do have trouble, that's going to be the first place I'm going to look. Sign out. Oh man, stuff's exploding. Cannot read property UID of null inside auth handler. So the auth state did change. It changed to signed out, right? But we called this thing anyway. So inside this callback, we can say if user, then call auth handler. Right? So we only want to do that if we're signed in. And if we're signed in, then we'll have this user object. Otherwise, we won't. We'll have null. So that's our clue that we really are signed in. So as soon as the page loads, as soon as this component loads, it'll run component will mount, which will run on auth state changed, which will wait for the state of our authentication to change, either from out to in or from in to out. And then it will call this function. And it'll pass in the user if there is one. So we want to check if there is one. And if there is, we want to call auth handler. So auth handler now is going to get called under two circumstances. One, we actually click the sign in button. And two, the auth state changes. The auth state changes when we sign in. Do we really need to do that in sign in component? It seems like it's the same thing. So what if we just don't call it here? Refresh, try clicking the button to sign in. It does the thing. It comes back. Yeah, we're signed in. So it looks like we don't need to do it there if we do it the other place. Understand why? Auth handler gets called whenever the auth state changes. Whenever we authenticate or whenever we sign out. So we don't need to explicitly say, hey, when you're finished signing in, call it. Because we've already said whether you sign in or sign out, call it. So we took it out of here. So let's click around here, test this out. Sign out. Okay, that's good. Sign in. There they are. Refresh while signed in. And although we briefly see the other, there it is. What if we, instead of component did mount, oh no, we said component will mount. Yeah, so it's already before it gets added to the DOM. But it's not quite early enough to stop the other thing from rendering. Refresh, yeah, we briefly see that, and then we see this. We good? Everything makes sense so far? Sort of? What was our last commit? Allow users to sign out. So what did we change? We can use get diff to see. We changed it so that is the whole auth handler? That's not. Oh, we just moved it. So we just moved that stuff out of component will mount. We changed the timing of that stuff so that it works after we refresh, right? That's the problem we were trying to solve. So rather than saying what we did in code, we'll say what we were actually accomplishing. Sync appropriately upon loading when already signed in.